Jake Peterson had always been a light sleeper, a habit developed from years of tending cattle and watching for predators on his Montana ranch. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover on that cold November night in 2024. 3 young women chained in a basement for over 2 years, their voices silenced by fear and their spirits nearly broken by unspeakable cruelty. What Jake did next would not only save their lives, but restore their faith in humanity itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 2024 had been particularly harsh in Clearwater Valley, Montana. Jake Peterson stood on the wraparound porch of his ranch house, watching dark clouds gather over the distant mountains. At 34, he had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical, since inheriting Sunset Ridge Ranch from his grandfather 5 years earlier. The 200-acre spread had been his sanctuary, a place where he could work with his hands and find peace away from the complexities of modern life. Jake's routine was predictable and comforting. Each morning began before sunrise with coffee on the porch, followed by rounds to check on his 100 head of cattle. The work was demanding, but rewarding, and the solitude suited him perfectly. He had always been more comfortable with animals than people, finding their honesty refreshing compared to the political games and social expectations he had left behind in his corporate life in Denver. The ranch sat at the edge of Clearwater Valley, where rolling pastures stretched toward dense pine forests that climbed the mountain slopes. His nearest neighbor was the old Garrett place, a rundown farmhouse visible through the trees about 2 miles southeast. Jake rarely saw activity there, though he occasionally noticed lights burning late into the night. Harold and Ruth Garrett kept to themselves, which was fine by Jake. In a small farming community of 800 people, everyone knew everyone else's business, but the Garretts had always been the exception. That particular evening, Jake was repairing a section of fence damaged by his bull when he first heard it. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the trees. But there it was again, carried on the crisp air, a desperate cry that made his blood run cold. Jake straightened, his hammer suspended mid-swing, straining to listen. The sound came from the direction of the Garrett property, though the thick stand of pines between the properties made it impossible to see what might be happening. Jake had always minded his own business. It was one of the unwritten rules of rural life, respecting your neighbor's privacy and expecting the same in return. But something about that cry gnawed at him. It wasn't the sound of an animal in distress, something he would have recognized immediately. This was different, more human, more urgent. As darkness settled over the valley, Jake found himself standing at his kitchen window, looking toward the Garrett place. A single light glowed in what appeared to be an upstairs window, but the rest of the property remained shrouded in shadows. He tried to convince himself he had imagined the sound, that it was perhaps a fox or coyote caught in a trap. But the feeling persisted, a nagging sense that something was terribly wrong. Jake had moved to Clearwater Valley, seeking the kind of life his grandfather had always described, one where neighbors looked out for each other and communities pulled together in times of need. But he had also learned that sometimes looking out for others meant respecting their boundaries. The Garretts had made it clear over the years that they preferred isolation. Harold Garrett was a stern man in his 60s who rarely spoke beyond basic pleasantries at the general store. His wife Ruth seemed nervous and skittish, always looking over her shoulder as if expecting trouble. The couple had moved to Clearwater Valley about 3 years earlier, purchasing the abandoned farmhouse for cash and immediately setting about making repairs. They claimed to be retired, though no one knew from what profession. Harold drove an old pickup truck to town for supplies twice a month, always alone, always in a hurry to complete his business and return home. Ruth was rarely seen, and when she did appear, she seemed to shrink from any attempt at conversation. Jake's grandfather had always taught him to trust his instincts, especially when it came to reading people and situations. Those instincts had served him well during his years in corporate consulting, helping him navigate complex business relationships and identify potential problems before they became crises. Now, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, every instinct was telling him that the cry he had heard was a call for help. The rational part of his mind argued against getting involved. The Garretts had never welcomed visitors, and showing up unannounced would likely be met with hostility. Jake had no evidence of wrongdoing, just a feeling that something wasn't right. In a community where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, accusations without proof could destroy reputations and relationships. But as the night wore on, Jake found himself unable to shake the memory of that desperate sound. He had heard fear before, during his time volunteering with search and rescue teams in Colorado. He knew the difference between ordinary distress and the kind of terror that came from facing genuine danger. What he had heard earlier carried that unmistakable note of desperation, the sound of someone pushed beyond their limits. Jake spent the night pacing his living room, alternately convincing himself to stay out of the Garrett's business and feeling compelled to investigate. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over him like a heavy blanket, but his resolve had crystallized. He would find a reason to visit the Garrett property, perhaps offering assistance with some imagined problem, or simply being a good neighbor checking on their welfare after the recent storms. The morning brought fresh complications. Danny Rodriguez, Jake's closest friend and the foreman of a neighboring ranch, stopped by for their weekly coffee and caught Jake staring toward the Garrett place with binoculars. "What's got you so interested in the hermits?" Danny asked, settling into one of the porch chairs with his steaming mug. Jake lowered the binoculars, feeling slightly foolish. "Probably nothing. Thought I heard something last night. Sounded like someone in distress." Danny's expression grew serious. At 42, he had lived in Clearwater Valley his entire life and had developed the same protective instincts that characterized most long-time residents. What kind of something? Hard to say. Could have been an animal, but it didn't sound right. Jake described the cry he had heard, watching as Danny's weathered face grew thoughtful. "The Garretts have always been odd ducks," Danny mused. "Never seen them at church, never at community events. Harold comes to town like he's on a mission, gets what he needs and disappears. Ruth looks scared of her own shadow. You think there's something wrong over there?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and studying the distant farmhouse. "I think people have a right to privacy, but I also think neighbors have a responsibility to look out for each other. If you heard something that concerned, you might be worth a friendly visit." The conversation continued for another hour, with both men weighing the pros and cons of investigating further. Danny shared observations from his years in the valley, small details that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture of a family living in deliberate isolation. The Garretts never seemed to have visitors, never appeared to leave the property together, and had declined every invitation to community gatherings with polite but firm refusals. As Danny prepared to leave, he turned back to Jake with a serious expression. "Trust your gut, brother. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Just be careful how you go about finding out." Die. The advice echoed in Jake's mind throughout the day as he went about his regular chores. Feeding cattle, checking water troughs, and mending equipment provided physical occupation, but left his thoughts free to wander. He found himself studying the Garrett property whenever his work brought him to that side of the ranch, looking for any signs of unusual activity. Late in the afternoon, while moving cattle to a different pasture, Jake noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the Garrett house. It seemed heavier than normal, as if they were burning more wood than necessary for cooking or basic heating. The observation added another piece to the puzzle forming in his mind, though he couldn't yet see the complete picture. As evening approached, Jake made his decision. He would approach the Garrett property under the pretense of being a concerned neighbor, perhaps offering assistance if they needed help with storm damage or winter preparations. It was a reasonable excuse that would allow him to assess the situation without seeming intrusive or suspicious. Jake cleaned up from his day's work and changed into fresh clothes, wanting to present himself as a respectable neighbor rather than a nosy intruder. He selected a bottle of homemade apple cider from his pantry, a gift that would provide a tangible reason for the visit and demonstrate friendly intentions. The walk across the field, separating his property from the Garretts, took about 20 minutes through terrain he knew well. Jake had explored every acre of his grandfather's ranch as a child, and the boundaries were as familiar as the rooms of his house. The approaching twilight cast long shadows through the pine trees, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as clear skies promised a cold night ahead. As Jake emerged from the tree line and approached the Garrett farmhouse, he was struck by how different it looked up close. What appeared to be routine maintenance from a distance revealed itself as extensive modifications. New locks had been installed on all visible doors, and several windows had been boarded up from the inside. A high fence surrounded the immediate yard area, topped with what looked like barbed wire barely visible in the gathering darkness. The modifications seemed excessive for a simple farming operation, more appropriate for a prison than a family home. Jake's unease deepened as he approached the front door, noting fresh tire tracks in the mud that suggested recent vehicle traffic, despite Harold's truck being parked in its usual spot beside the house. Jake knocked firmly on the front door, holding the bottle of cider and preparing his neighborly greeting. Footsteps approached slowly, followed by the sound of multiple locks being disengaged. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Harold Garrett's suspicious face, though the security chain remained in place. "What do you want?" Harold's voice was harsh, lacking any pretense of neighborly courtesy. "Evening, Mr. Garrett." Jake, Peterson from Sunset Ridge Ranch, brought you folks some fresh cider and wanted to check if you needed any help preparing for winter. Looks like we're in for some cold weather. Harold's eyes darted nervously, and Jake noticed perspiration on the man's forehead despite the cool evening air. "We don't need any help. Thank you for the cider, but we prefer to keep to ourselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." So before Jake could respond, he heard it again, that same desperate cry that had haunted him the night before. This time there was no mistaking its source or nature. It was definitely human, definitely female, and definitely coming from inside the Garrett house. The sound was quickly muffled as if someone had covered the person's mouth, but not before Jake heard what sounded like multiple voices, all female, all terrified. Harold's face went white, and his hand tightened on the door. "You need to leave, now!" But Jake had heard enough to know that whatever was happening inside the Garrett house was far from normal. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that sometimes being a good neighbor meant taking risks to protect others. Jake took a step back from the door, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just heard. "Is everything all right in there, Mr. Garrett?" Sounded like someone might need help. "Everything's fine. You're trespassing on private property. Leave or I'll call the sheriff." The threat confirmed Jake's growing suspicions. An innocent man with nothing to hide wouldn't resort to intimidation so quickly. Jake nodded politely, setting the bottle of cider on the porch step. "I'll leave this here for you folks. Have a good evening." As Jake walked away from the house, his mind was already formulating a plan. He had heard enough to know that people were in distress inside the Garrett house, and every instinct told him they were in serious danger. The question now was how to help them without making the situation worse or putting them at greater risk. The walk back to his ranch seemed to take forever, Jake's thoughts consumed by what he had witnessed. The boarded windows, excessive security measures, and Harold's nervous behavior all pointed to something sinister happening behind the facade of rural isolation. Most troubling of all were the voices he had heard, young and desperate, crying out for help that wasn't coming. Back at his ranch house, Jake tried to think through his options logically. Calling Sheriff Tom Bradley was the obvious choice, but Jake knew the local law enforcement was stretched thin across the county's vast rural territory. More importantly, he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, just suspicions based on unusual behavior and sounds that could potentially be explained away. Jake also worried about the time factor. If people were truly in danger inside the Garrett house, involving official channels might take too long or alert the perpetrators to outside interest. Harold had already demonstrated his willingness to use threats, and Jake feared what might happen to any victims if the man felt cornered or exposed. As night fell over Clearwater Valley, Jake found himself facing a decision that would change everything. He could play it safe, file a report with the sheriff, and hope that official investigation would uncover the truth. Or he could trust his instincts and take direct action to help what sounded like multiple people in desperate need of rescue. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Jake had heard genuine terror in those voices, and he knew he would never forgive himself if he failed to act when action was needed most. Whatever was happening at the Garrett place, whoever was crying out for help in the darkness, they deserved someone willing to take risks on their behalf. Jake Peterson had always believed that true character was revealed not in moments of comfort, but in times of crisis, when moral courage was required despite personal cost. As he prepared for what might be the most important night of his life, he knew he was about to discover exactly what kind of man he really was. Jake spent the next 3 hours preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous thing he had ever attempted. The rational part of his mind kept questioning whether he was overreacting, but the memory of those terrified voices pushed him forward. He gathered supplies methodically, treating the mission like the search and rescue operations he had participated in during his Colorado days. From his gun safe, Jake retrieved his grandfather's hunting rifle and a box of ammunition. He wasn't planning on violence, but Harold Garrett's threatening demeanor suggested the man might not respond well to being discovered. Jake also packed a first aid kit, bottled water, energy bars, and a powerful LED flashlight. His cell phone showed weak signal strength, typical for the remote valley, but he made sure it was fully charged anyway. The plan forming in Jake's mind was simple but risky. He would approach the Garrett property after midnight when the occupants were likely asleep, conduct reconnaissance to confirm his suspicions, and then decide whether to attempt a rescue or call for backup. The timing felt crucial. Harold had been agitated during their earlier encounter, and Jake worried that any delay might result in the victims being moved or worse. At 11:30, Jake set out across the darkened field separating his ranch from the Garrett property. The November night was brutally cold, with a sharp wind that cut through his heavy jacket and made his eyes water. Above, stars glittered in a clear sky that promised frost by morning. Jake moved carefully, using the moonlight to navigate familiar terrain while staying alert for any sounds that might indicate he had been detected. The approach to the Garrett house took longer than his earlier visit because Jake was being deliberately cautious. He circled the property twice, noting the positions of windows, doors, and outbuildings. The excessive security measures were even more apparent in the darkness, with motion sensor lights positioned around the perimeter and what appeared to be camera equipment mounted under the eaves. Most of the house remained dark, but Jake noticed lights in the basement windows, unusual for a typical farmhouse where basements were usually used for storage rather than living space. The glow was dim and flickering, suggesting candles or lanterns rather than electric lighting. Jake's unease deepened as he wondered why the basement would be occupied while the main floors appeared empty. Staying low and moving between shadows, Jake approached the side of the house where the basement windows were located. The windows were small and set high in the foundation, typical of older farm construction, but they provided just enough visibility for Jake to peer inside if he could get close enough. What Jake saw through that first basement window would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 young women sat huddled together on a bare concrete floor, their wrists secured with heavy chains that were bolted to the basement walls. The oldest appeared to be in her late teens, with long dark hair that hung in tangles around her face. The middle girl looked younger, perhaps 16, her blonde hair matted and dirty. The youngest was clearly just a child, maybe 14, with auburn hair and freckles visible even through the grime that covered her face. All 3 were wearing thin clothing that provided little protection against the basement's obvious chill. They sat pressed together for warmth, their faces bearing expressions of exhaustion and despair that spoke of prolonged captivity. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the window frame, struggling to process the horror of what he was witnessing. The basement itself was a nightmare of deliberate cruelty. The walls were bare concrete, stained with moisture and what looked like rust, or worse. A single bucket sat in one corner, obviously serving as the only sanitation facility. Scattered around the floor were empty food containers and water bottles, suggesting the women were fed sporadically and minimally. Jake watched as the oldest girl tried to comfort the youngest, stroking her hair and whispering words he couldn't hear through the glass. The middle girl stared at the ceiling with vacant eyes, her spirit seemingly broken by whatever ordeal she had endured. The scene spoke of months or even years of imprisonment, systematic abuse designed to break their will and eliminate hope. Rage flooded through Jake like molten metal, followed immediately by a cold determination that surprised him with its intensity. These weren't just victims, they were someone's daughters, sisters, perhaps mothers themselves. They had been stolen from their lives and families, reduced to objects for the sadistic pleasure of their captors. Jake forced himself to continue his reconnaissance, knowing he needed to understand the full scope of the situation before acting. Moving to another basement window, he discovered a second room containing what appeared to be Harold and Ruth's living quarters. The contrast was stark and deliberate. This space was warm and comfortable, with a bed, chairs, and even a small television. Ruth Garrett sat in a worn armchair, staring at a muted television screen, while Harold paced nearby. Their conversation was animated but quiet, with Harold gesturing aggressively while Ruth cowered in her chair. Jake couldn't hear their words, but the body language suggested an argument or perhaps Harold giving instructions. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Ruth wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active participant in whatever. Horror was unfolding in the next room. The nervous, frightened woman he had occasionally seen in town was complicit in the imprisonment and abuse of 3 innocent young women. Jake pulled back from the window, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a rescue plan. The basement had 2 rooms, with the captives secured in the larger space, and their captors occupying the smaller adjacent area. Any rescue attempt would need to account for both Harold and Ruth, as well as the unknown factors of additional security measures or weapons. The chains securing the women appeared substantial, requiring either keys or tools to remove. Jake had brought basic equipment, but nothing sophisticated enough to deal with heavy restraints quickly and quietly. Time would be critical. Any rescue attempt that alerted the Garretts would put the victims at immediate risk. Jake considered his options carefully. He could retreat and call Sheriff Bradley, but the response time to such a remote location would be at least 30 minutes, giving the Garretts plenty of time to harm or relocate their prisoners. He could attempt to disable Harold and Ruth first, but that would require entering the house and potentially alerting them to his presence. The third option was the most dangerous, but potentially most effective. Jake could create a diversion to draw Harold away from the basement, then attempt to free the women while Ruth was alone. It was risky and dependent on numerous variables, but it offered the best chance of getting the victims to safety without putting them in greater immediate danger. Jake retreated to his equipment cache hidden in the tree line and began implementing his plan. He had noticed a barn about 50 yards from the main house, old and dry enough to burn quickly if ignited. A fire would certainly draw Harold's attention and likely prompt him to investigate, leaving Ruth alone with the prisoners. Moving carefully through the darkness, Jake approached the barn and examined its construction. The building was indeed old and weathered, with plenty of dry hay and wooden beams that would create an impressive blaze. Jake gathered dried grass and small kindling, creating a fire starter that would ignite slowly enough to give him time to reach the basement before Harold responded to the emergency. As Jake prepared to light the fire, he heard new sounds from the direction of the house. Footsteps on wooden stairs, followed by the creak of a door opening. Jake froze, straining to identify the source and direction of the noise. Through the basement windows, he could see movement as Harold descended into the captive's room. What Jake witnessed next filled him with such rage that he nearly abandoned stealth entirely. Harold was carrying what appeared to be a leather strap, or belt, his intentions clearly malevolent. The three women cowered against the far wall, the youngest beginning to sob as Harold approached them with obvious violent intent. Jake's carefully laid plans evaporated in an instant. These women had suffered enough, and he would not stand by while their torment continued for even one more minute. Abandoning the barn, Jake ran back toward the house, no longer concerned with stealth or strategy. The basement had an exterior entrance, a set of concrete steps leading down to a heavy wooden door. Jake had noted it during his earlier reconnaissance, but dismissed it as likely secured. Now, faced with immediate crisis, he decided to attempt direct entry regardless of the obstacles. The door was indeed locked, but Jake's adrenaline and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Using his rifle butt as a lever, he pried at the doorframe until the wood began to splinter. The noise was considerable, but Jake was beyond caring about subtlety. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the door gave way with a crack that echoed through the night air. Jake burst into the basement, rifle ready, expecting immediate confrontation with Harold Garrett. Instead, he found the man standing frozen in shock, the leather strap still raised in his hand, while the three women watched in amazement as their unlikely rescuer materialized from the darkness. For a moment, nobody moved, the tableau frozen. In disbelief and confusion, Harold recovered first, his face contorting with rage as he realized his carefully guarded secret had been discovered. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled, raising the strap as if to strike Jake instead of his intended victims. Jake's response was swift and decisive. Years of ranch work had given him strength and reflexes that Harold clearly hadn't anticipated. Jake lunged forward, tackling the older man and driving him backward into the concrete wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Harold and sent the leather strap flying across the room. "Stay down," Jake commanded, keeping the rifle trained on. Harold, while addressing the women, "I'm here to help. We're getting you out of here." The oldest of the three women found her voice first, her words barely a whisper after months of enforced silence. "Are you real? Are you really here to help us?" "Yes," Jake replied, his heart breaking at the doubt and hope warring in her voice. "What are your names?" "I'm Jake Peterson, and I'm going to get you all to safety." "I'm Amanda," the oldest managed to say. "This is Claire and Hannah. We're sisters. We've been here for over 2 years. 2 years. Jake's mind reeled at the... Implications of such prolonged captivity. These young women had been stolen from their lives as teenagers and children, imprisoned and abused while the world continued spinning without them. The magnitude of their suffering was almost incomprehensible. "Where are the keys to these chains?" Jake demanded, turning his attention back to Harold, who was struggling to regain his breath after the collision with the wall. Harold's response was a sneer of defiance. "You'll never find them. And even if you do, you'll never get them out. Of here alive, this valley has ways of dealing with troublemakers." The threat was clear, but Jake was past the point of intimidation. He had found 3 innocent victims of unspeakable cruelty, and nothing would prevent him from seeing them safely away from this house of horrors. "Ruth!" Harold called suddenly, his voice echoing through the basement. "Ruth, get down here now!" Jake realized his mistake in focusing solely on Harold. Ruth was still somewhere in the house, and her involvement meant she might be armed or preparing some kind of counterattack. The situation was rapidly becoming more complex and dangerous. Footsteps thundered overhead as Ruth responded to Harold's summons. Jake heard her moving quickly through the house, and within moments she appeared at the top of the basement stairs. In her hands was a shotgun, and her previous nervous demeanor had been replaced by cold determination. "Let him go and get out of here," Ruth commanded, her voice steady despite the weapon trembling slightly in her grip. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." Jake found himself caught between 2 armed opponents with 3 chained victims, depending on him for salvation. The basement offered little cover, and any gunfight would likely result in injury or death for the very people he was trying to save. "I understand perfectly," Jake replied, keeping his voice calm while his mind raced through possible solutions. "You've kidnapped and imprisoned 3 innocent women. The only thing I don't understand is how you could live with yourselves." Ruth's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Innocent? You have no idea what these 3 have cost us, what they've put us through. They deserved everything that happened to them." The twisted logic of the abuser, blaming victims for their own suffering, was something Jake had read about but never encountered directly. The complete lack of empathy or remorse in Ruth's voice was more chilling than any physical threat. Amanda spoke up from her position against the wall, her voice stronger now despite her obvious fear. "We never did anything to you. You took us from our family, from our lives. We were just children." "Children who knew too much," Harold growled, finally regaining his feet but keeping his distance from Jake's rifle. "Children who saw things they shouldn't have seen, who would have brought trouble to people who didn't deserve it." Jake began to understand that this wasn't a random kidnapping or human trafficking operation. The sisters had witnessed something that threatened Harold and Ruth, something serious enough to justify years of imprisonment rather than simply moving away or eliminating the witnesses entirely. "What did they see?" Jake asked, genuinely curious, despite the immediate danger of the situation. Harold and Ruth exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Ruth's grip on the shotgun tightened, and Jake realized that whatever secret the sisters had discovered was significant enough that the Garretts were prepared to kill to protect it. "That's not your concern," Ruth said finally. "Your concern should be getting out of here alive and forgetting what you've seen. These girls don't exist anymore. They haven't existed for 2 years, and no one is looking for them." The casual dismissal of 3 human lives, as if they were objects to be discarded, was the final straw for Jake's restraint. He had tried to handle the situation diplomatically, but faced with such callous disregard for innocent life, diplomacy was no longer an option. Jake's next move was calculated to create maximum confusion while minimizing risk to the sisters. He fired a shot into the concrete ceiling directly above Ruth's position, the sound deafening in the confined space while debris rained down on her head. Ruth instinctively ducked and stumbled, her finger squeezing the shotgun trigger reflexively. The blast went wide, pellets embedding in the basement wall well away from any human targets. In the confusion that followed, Jake lunged forward and tackled Harold again, this time driving him to the floor and pinning him there. "Amanda, can you reach that shotgun?" Jake called out, hoping the oldest sister was alert enough to help secure the weapon. Despite her chains, Amanda was able to stretch far enough to kick the shotgun away from Ruth's reaching hands. The weapon slid across the concrete floor, coming to rest against the far wall where none of the combatants could easily reach it. Ruth scrambled to her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where concrete debris had struck her. Her eyes darted between Jake, her husband, and the scattered shotgun, calculating her odds of reaching the weapon before Jake could stop her. "Don't even think about it," Jake warned, keeping Harold pinned while trying to watch Ruth simultaneously. "This is over. Where are the keys to those chains?" Ruth's response was to bolt for the stairs, clearly intending to flee the basement and perhaps call for help or retrieve additional weapons. Jake faced an impossible choice: pursue Ruth and allow Harold to potentially harm the sisters, or secure Harold and let Ruth escape to cause unknown complications. The decision was made for him when Claire, the middle sister, spoke up for the first time since Jake's arrival. "The keys are in his front pocket," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from disuse but determined. "He always keeps them there." Jake shifted his position to search Harold's pockets while keeping the man pinned. Harold struggled and cursed, but Jake's adrenaline and righteous anger gave him strength that the older man couldn't match. Sure enough, a ring of keys was clipped to Harold's belt, hidden beneath his jacket. The keys were a mix of house keys and what appeared to be specialized locks. Jake quickly identified the ones that looked heavy enough for the chains and began the process of freeing the sisters. Amanda was first, tears streaming down her face as the heavy shackles fell away from her wrists for the first time in over 2 years. "Can you walk?" Jake asked as Amanda rubbed her freed wrists, trying to restore circulation to hands that had been constrained for so long. "I think so," Amanda replied, struggling to her feet with obvious difficulty. "We haven't walked much in a very long time." Jake moved quickly to free Claire and then Hannah, the youngest sister, collapsing into Amanda's arms as soon as her chains were removed. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful. 3 sisters holding each other after enduring unimaginable separation despite being imprisoned in the same room. Harold continued to struggle beneath Jake's grip, threatening revenge and promising that Jake would never make it off the property alive. The threats seemed increasingly hollow as the man's carefully constructed prison began to crumble around him. But Jake remained alert to the possibility that Harold had allies or resources he hadn't yet revealed. "We need to get out of here now," Jake told the sisters, helping Hannah to her feet while keeping an eye on the stairs where Ruth had disappeared. "Can you make it to my ranch? It's about 2 miles through the woods." Amanda nodded, though Jake could see the exhaustion and malnutrition that made even basic movement difficult for all 3 women. They had survived 2 years of captivity, but their ordeal had taken a tremendous physical toll that would require medical attention and long recovery. "What about him?" Claire asked, gesturing toward Harold, who was still pinned beneath Jake's. Wait, Jake had been wrestling with the same question. He couldn't leave Harold free to pursue them or harm other potential victims, but he also couldn't maintain physical control over the man while helping 3 weakened women navigate 2 miles of difficult terrain in the dark. The solution came from an unexpected source. Hannah, despite being the youngest and presumably most traumatized of the sisters, pulled the remaining chains toward Harold with grim determination. "Chain him up," she said simply. "Let him see what it feels like." The poetic justice of the suggestion appealed to Jake, though he worried about the legal implications of restraining Harold even under these circumstances. However, the immediate priority was getting the sisters to safety, and securing Harold would eliminate at least one threat to their escape. Working quickly, Jake used the same chains that had held the sisters to secure Harold to the basement wall. The man's curses and threats became increasingly desperate as he realized his situation had completely reversed. But Jake felt no sympathy for someone who had shown such cruelty to innocent victims. "Ruth will call for help," Harold warned. As Jake finished securing the chains, "You'll never make it to town. This valley protects its own, and you're not one of us." The threat suggested that Harold and Ruth's operation had broader support in the community, a possibility that Jake found deeply disturbing. If other residents were involved or aware of the kidnapping, then simply reaching safety might be more complicated than Jake had anticipated. "We'll take our chances," Jake replied, helping Amanda gather what few possessions the sisters had managed to retain during their captivity. "And if Ruth calls anyone, they'll have to explain why they're helping kidnappers and child abusers." As Jake prepared to lead the sisters out of their basement prison, he took one last look around the space that had been their world for over 2 years. The bare concrete walls, the bucket in the corner, the scattered food containers, all bore witness to suffering that no human being should ever endure. But the sisters had endured it. They had survived when many others might have given up hope entirely. Their strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty was a testament to the human spirit's capacity for survival even under the worst circumstances. Now it was Jake's responsibility to ensure that their survival led to true freedom, that their rescue was the beginning of healing rather than simply a brief respite from captivity. The journey to safety was just beginning, and Jake knew that the real challenges might still lie ahead. The journey from the garret basement to freedom began with 3 steps up concrete stairs that the sisters hadn't climbed in over 2 years. Amanda went first, her legs shaking with weakness at the overwhelming reality that she was finally leaving the place that had defined her existence since she was 17. Claire followed, gripping the handrail with white knuckles as she forced muscles that had atrophied from confinement to carry her upward. Hannah brought up the rear, tears streaming down her face as she took her first breaths of fresh air since childhood. Jake kept his rifle ready while scanning the darkness for any sign of Ruth Garrett. The woman had vanished after fleeing the basement, and her absence was more troubling than her presence had been. Jake knew that people like Ruth didn't simply give up when their carefully constructed world collapsed. She was either planning a counterattack or seeking help from whatever network had enabled the sisters' imprisonment for so long. The November night seemed even colder after the basement's stale warmth, and Jake quickly realized that the sisters' thin clothing would be inadequate protection against the Montana winter. Their captors had kept them in summer clothes, perhaps as another form of control, or simply because proper winter gear might have facilitated escape attempts. "Here, take my jacket," Jake said, shrugging out of his heavy coat and draping it around Hannah's shoulders. The younger sister was already shivering violently, her small frame overwhelmed by the sudden temperature change. Amanda shook her head when Jake started to remove his sweater as well. "We'll manage," she said through chattering teeth. "We've survived worse than cold." The simple statement carried the weight of everything the sisters had endured, and Jake felt a renewed surge of admiration for their resilience. They had been broken down systematically over 2 years, yet somehow their core strength remained intact. It was a reminder that the human spirit could survive almost anything when motivated by hope and the desire to protect those we love. Jake led them away from the house through the tree line, choosing a route that provided maximum cover, while still allowing reasonable progress toward his ranch. The sisters moved slowly, their muscles cramping and joints protesting after months of limited movement. Jake found himself constantly balancing the need for speed with their physical limitations, knowing that every minute increased the risk of pursuit, while also understanding that pushing them too hard might result in injury or collapse. "Tell me about what you saw," Jake said quietly, as they paused for Amanda to rest against a pine tree. "Harold mentioned that you witnessed something. Understanding what we're dealing with might help me keep you safe." Amanda exchanged glances with her sisters, some silent communication passing between them. Claire nodded slowly, while Hannah pressed closer to Amanda's side, as if seeking protection from memories as much as the cold. "It was August, 2 years ago," Amanda began, her voice barely audible above the wind through the trees. "We were camping with our parents at Glacier National Park. Claire and Hannah wanted to collect wildflowers, so we hiked off the main trail to find better specimens." She paused, gathering strength to continue with what was obviously a painful memory. "We got lost and ended up following what we thought was a trail back to the campground. Instead, we stumbled into a clearing where Harold and Ruth were meeting, with several other people. They had trucks loaded with something, and they were transferring the cargo to smaller vehicles." "What kind of cargo?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would explain the extreme measures taken to silence the sisters. Claire spoke up for the first time since leaving the basement, her voice stronger than Jake had expected. "Drugs. Lots of them. Packages and packages of what looked like cocaine or heroin. We'd seen enough movies and news reports to recognize what we were looking at." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. The Garretts weren't just isolated farmers living quietly in rural Montana. They were part of a drug distribution network, using their remote location as a transfer point for illegal substances moving through the region. The sisters had witnessed a major criminal operation, making them witnesses to federal crimes that could send numerous people to prison for decades. "We tried to back away quietly," Hannah added, her young voice still carrying the trauma of that moment. "But Harold saw us. He pointed and shouted, and suddenly all these men were chasing us through the forest." Amanda took over the narrative, again, her words coming faster as the memories flooded back. "They caught us within a few hundred yards. We were just kids, and they were adults who knew the terrain. Harold kept asking what we'd seen, who we'd told, whether our parents knew, where we were." "What did you tell them?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The truth," Claire replied. "We said we'd gotten lost and would just go back to our campsite and not say anything. We promised we wouldn't tell anyone what we'd seen. We just wanted to go home." Jake could imagine the scene. 3 terrified young women pleading for their lives while hardened criminals decided their fate. The sisters had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, innocent victims of circumstances beyond their control. "They didn't believe us," Amanda continued, "or maybe they couldn't risk that we might change our minds later. They said they needed time to figure out what to do with us, that they couldn't just let us go until they were sure we wouldn't cause problems. So they brought you to the farmhouse," Jake concluded, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Hannah nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "They told our parents we'd fallen into a river and been swept away, made it look like an accident. Our mom and dad think we're dead." The cruelty of that deception was almost worse than the physical imprisonment. Not only had the sisters been stolen from their lives, but their parents had been forced to grieve. Children who were actually alive and suffering just a few hundred miles away. Jake tried to imagine the agony of parents who had spent 2 years believing their daughters were dead, never knowing that they were so close, yet so unreachable. "They kept saying it was temporary," Claire added bitterly, "that they just needed to wait for things to cool down, for the investigation into our disappearance to be closed. But months turned into years, and they never let us go." Jake understood now why Harold had been so threatened by his visit. The shy man wasn't just hiding kidnapping victims. He was protecting a criminal enterprise that probably involved multiple people and significant money. The sisters represented evidence that could destroy not just Harold and Ruth, but an entire network of drug dealers and distributors. As they resumed walking through the forest, Jake's mind raced through the implications of what he'd learned. If the drug operation was as extensive as the sisters suggested, then Harold's threat about the valley protecting its own might be more than empty bluster. There could be other people involved, perhaps including some in positions of authority, who would work to cover up the sisters' rescue and return them to captivity. The thought made Jake quicken his pace, despite the sisters' obvious exhaustion. They needed to reach safety quickly, and safety might be farther away than his ranch. If the drug network had local connections, then even Sheriff Bradley might not be trustworthy. Jake began considering options for getting the sisters completely out of the valley, perhaps to federal authorities who would be outside the influence of local corruption. "Tell me about the other people you saw," Jake said, as they navigated around a fallen tree that blocked their path. "Would you recognize them if you saw them again?" "Some of them," Amanda replied. "There was a man with a scar on his face who seemed to be in charge. He's the one who made the decision to take us. And there was a woman with red hair who kept arguing with him about what to do." Claire added more details as they walked. "We saw the same people several times over the first few months when they came to check on us. Harold would bring them down to the basement to look at us like we were animals in a zoo. They'd discuss us like we couldn't hear them, talking about whether we were still a threat and when they might be able to let us go." "When did you realize they were never going to release you?" Jake asked. Hannah's voice was small but clear. "When they stopped talking about letting us go and started talking about what to do with us permanently. That was about 6 months ago. Ruth started bringing us less food, and Harold talked about moving us somewhere else." The timeline suggested that something had changed recently, perhaps pressure from law enforcement or problems within the drug network that made the sisters' continued existence more dangerous to their captors. Jake wondered if their rescue had come just in time to prevent something even worse than continued imprisonment. They were approaching the halfway point to Jake's ranch when they heard the first sounds of pursuit. Engines starting in the distance, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel roads. Jake counted at least 2 vehicles, possibly more, which meant that Ruth had indeed called for help and that help had arrived with disturbing speed. "We need to move faster," Jake told the sisters, though he could see that they were already at their physical limits. Amanda was leaning heavily on Claire for support, while Hannah stumbled frequently as exhaustion overcame her determination to keep moving. "Maybe you should leave us," Amanda said between gasping breaths. "You could get help and come back for us. We're just slowing you down." Jake's response was immediate and firm. "That's not happening. We started this together, and we're finishing it together. No one gets left behind." The conviction in his voice seemed to give the sisters new strength. They straightened their shoulders and picked up the pace, drawing on reserves of endurance that Jake didn't know how they possessed after 2 years of captivity and malnutrition. The sound of the pursuing vehicles grew closer, and Jake realized they weren't going to reach his ranch before being overtaken. The Garretts and their allies knew the local roads better than Jake knew the forest paths, and vehicles could cover ground much faster than people on foot through difficult terrain. Jake quickly revised his plan, looking for defensible positions, or alternative routes that might give them an advantage. About a quarter-mile ahead, he remembered an old hunting cabin that his grandfather had built decades earlier. It was little more than a shack, but it would provide shelter and a place to make a stand if necessary. "There's a cabin ahead," Jake told the sisters as they pushed through a thick stand of young pines. "We can rest there and figure out our next move." The cabin appeared through the trees exactly where Jake remembered it, though years of neglect had taken their toll on the structure. The roof sagged ominously and several windows were broken, but the walls appeared sound enough to provide basic protection from both weather and bullets. Jake helped the sisters inside while keeping watch for signs of their pursuers. The interior was sparse but functional, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of rustic furniture, and shelves that still held some of his grandfather's old supplies. More importantly, the cabin had a back door that would allow escape if the front entrance was compromised. "Stay away from the windows," Jake instructed as he checked his rifle and the spare ammunition he had brought. "If anyone comes looking for us, get down behind that overturned table and don't move until I tell you." Amanda positioned herself where she could watch over her younger sisters while still following Jake's instructions. "What happens if they find us here?" she asked quietly. Jake considered lying, offering false reassurance that everything would work out fine. But these young women had survived 2 years of hell by facing reality honestly, and they deserved the same honesty from him now. "Then we fight," he said simply. "I didn't come this far to let them take you back." The first vehicle arrived. About 10 minutes later, its headlights sweeping through the forest as it searched for any sign of their passage. Jake watched through a crack in the shuttered window as an old pickup truck stopped on the dirt road about 50 yards from the cabin. 2 men got out, both carrying flashlights and what appeared to be hunting rifles. Jake didn't recognize either man, which confirmed his suspicion that the drug operation involved people from outside the immediate area. These weren't local farmers helping a neighbor. They were criminals protecting a business investment. "They went this way," one of the men called out, his voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "Harold said the rancher was probably taking them back to his place, but they should have been moving faster than this." "Maybe they're hiding somewhere," the second man replied. 3 women who've been chained up for 2 years aren't going to be setting any speed records." The casual way they discussed the sisters' suffering made Jake's blood boil. These men saw the young women as nothing more than problems to be solved, obstacles to their criminal enterprise that needed to be eliminated. A second vehicle arrived. As the first 2 men began searching the area around the cabin, this one was a larger SUV that disgorged 3 more people, including a woman with red hair who matched Claire's description of one of the original conspirators. "Fan out and check every building, every hiding spot," the woman ordered, with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "They can't have gone far, and we need to find them before they reach help." Jake realized that he was facing a coordinated search by people who were experienced at this kind of work. They moved efficiently, covering ground systematically while maintaining communication with each other. These weren't amateur criminals stumbling around in the dark. They were professionals who had probably dealt with similar situations before. The sisters huddled behind the overturned table as instructed, holding each other tightly while trying to control their breathing. Jake could see the terror in their eyes as they listened to their former captors searching for them, probably wondering if their brief taste of freedom was about to end as quickly as it had begun. "If they catch us, what will they do to us?" Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible even in the cabin's silence. Amanda's response was honest, but gentle. "It doesn't matter, because we're not going back. Whatever happens, we're not going back to that basement." The determination in her voice reminded Jake of something his grandfather had once told him about cornered animals being the most dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. The sisters had already lost everything once. They wouldn't allow it to happen again without a fight. One of the searchers was approaching the cabin, his flashlight beams sweeping back and forth as he examined the ground for footprints or other signs of passage. Jake held his rifle ready, knowing that once shooting started, stealth would no longer be an option. Everything would depend on speed, accuracy, and the element of surprise. The man reached the cabin's front door and paused, apparently listening for any sounds from inside. Jake could hear him breathing heavily from the exertion of hiking through the forest, and the sound of his radio crackling as he prepared to report his position to the others. "Got something here!" the man called out, his voice loud enough to alert his companions. Old cabin. Looks like it's been abandoned for years, but the door's been opened recently. Jake's heart sank as he realized their hiding place had been discovered. The cabin that he had hoped would provide sanctuary was about to become a trap, with armed criminals surrounding the building while he tried to protect 3 weakened young women. The radio crackled again as the red-haired woman's voice cut through the static. "Check it out, but be careful. The rancher is armed and probably desperate. Take him alive if possible, but don't take any unnecessary risks." The instruction confirmed what Jake had suspected about their pursuers' priorities. They wanted to eliminate the sisters as witnesses, but they also recognized that killing a local rancher would bring unwanted attention from law enforcement. If possible, they would prefer to make Jake disappear quietly along with the women he was trying to protect. The man outside began testing the door handle, apparently surprised to find it unlocked. Jake had deliberately left it that way, hoping to avoid the noise of forced entry that would alert the searchers to their presence. Now that strategy was backfiring as the man prepared to enter the cabin. Jake positioned himself behind the door, rifle ready to strike the moment the man entered. The sisters remained hidden behind the table, following his instructions despite their obvious terror. Everything depended on the next few seconds and Jake's ability to neutralize the immediate threat without alerting the other searchers to their exact location. The door creaked open slowly as the man peered inside, his flashlight beam sweeping across the cabin's interior. Jake held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The man took one step inside, then another, his attention focused on the dark corners where someone might be hiding. Jake's attack was swift and silent. He brought the rifle butt down hard on the back of the man's head, dropping him instantly to the cabin floor. The flashlight fell from nerveless fingers and rolled across the wooden planks, its beam creating crazy shadows that danced across the walls. "One down," Jake whispered to the sisters as he quickly searched the unconscious man for weapons and communication equipment. He found a pistol, extra ammunition, and a radio that was already crackling with inquiries about the search's status. "Johnson, report," came the red-haired woman's voice through the radio. "What's your situation?" Jake realized he had perhaps 30 seconds before the woman became suspicious of Johnson's silence. 30 seconds to decide whether to answer the radio and try to buy more time, or to assume that their position was compromised and prepare for immediate attack. The decision was made for him when Hannah suddenly gasped and pointed toward the back window. "There's someone coming around behind the cabin," she whispered urgently. Jake spun around to see another flashlight beam approaching the rear of the building. They were already surrounded, with searchers closing in from multiple directions. The brief advantage of surprise was gone, and now they faced a fighting retreat with minimal ammunition against superior numbers. "Stay down and follow my lead," Jake told the sisters as he moved to a position where he could cover both the front and back entrances. "When I start shooting, you run for the trees behind the cabin. Don't stop, don't look back, just run." Amanda shook her head firmly. "We're not leaving you behind to face this alone." "Yes, you are," Jake replied with finality. "This is what I signed up for when I decided to help you. Your job is to survive and tell the world what happened to you. My job is to make sure you get that chance." Before the sisters could argue further, the radio crackled with the red-haired woman's voice, now sharp with suspicion and authority. "All units converge on the cabin. Johnson is not responding, and they're probably inside. Take them alive if possible, but prioritize securing the targets." Jake checked his rifle one final time and prepared to make the stand that would determine whether 3 innocent young women would finally find freedom or return to a captivity that would almost certainly end in their deaths. The cabin that had represented safety just minutes earlier was now the stage for a confrontation that would test everything Jake believed about courage, sacrifice, and the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The first gunshot shattered the Montana night like thunder, Jake's rifle bucking against his shoulder as he fired through the cabin's front window at a muzzle flash that had appeared in the tree line. The sisters dropped to the floor instantly, their reflexes honed by 2 years of surviving under constant threat. Glass exploded inward as return fire peppered the cabin's weathered walls, splinters of wood raining down on everyone inside. "Move now!" Jake shouted over the chaos, laying down covering fire as Amanda, Claire, and Hannah scrambled toward the back door. His grandfather's old hunting cabin was sturdy, but it hadn't been built to withstand a coordinated assault by armed criminals determined to eliminate witnesses to their drug operation. The sisters burst through the rear exit into the frigid night air, their breath forming white clouds as they ran for the darkness of the forest. Jake followed closely behind, pausing only to send 2 more shots toward the advancing figures before abandoning the cabin that had provided such brief sanctuary. Behind them, the red-haired woman's voice cut through the gunfire with military precision. "They're running north toward the Peterson ranch. Martinez, take your team and cut them off at the creek crossing. Williams, circle around and block the main trail. Nobody gets past us tonight." Jake's blood chilled as he realized the scope of their pursuers' knowledge about the local terrain. These people had been operating in Clearwater Valley long enough to know every path, every landmark, every potential escape route. What he had thought was his home advantage was actually theirs, built through years of moving illegal cargo through these same forests under cover of darkness. The sisters stumbled through undergrowth that tore at their thin clothing, Hannah crying out softly as thorns raked across her exposed arms. Amanda immediately moved to help her youngest sister, wrapping her own body around Hannah to shield her from the worst of the branches, while Claire took point to break trail through the dense vegetation. "This way," Jake whispered urgently, veering away from the direct route to his ranch that their pursuers were obviously expecting them to take. "There's an old mining road that might get us around their search pattern." The abandoned road was little more than 2 parallel ruts carved into the mountainside decades earlier when copper prospectors had combed these hills seeking fortune. It was overgrown and treacherous in the darkness, but it offered the possibility of avoiding the obvious trails that their enemies would be watching. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the temperature dropped noticeably. Jake's jacket around Hannah's shoulders provided some protection, but all 3 sisters were shivering violently from a combination of cold and adrenaline. Their breath came in ragged gasps as muscles weakened by captivity struggled with the demanding terrain. "I can't keep going," Claire whispered, as they paused behind a large boulder to rest and listen for sounds of pursuit. "My legs feel like they're going to give out." Amanda immediately knelt beside her sister, rubbing Claire's arms to stimulate circulation, while speaking in the gentle but firm tone of someone accustomed to being the protector. "Yes, you can. Remember what we promised each other in that basement. We survived together, or not at all." Jake marveled at the dynamic between the sisters, forged through shared suffering but expressing itself in mutual support, rather than the desperation or selfishness that might have been expected. They had spent 2 years taking care of each other under impossible circumstances, and that bond was now serving them well in their fight for freedom. The sound of engines grew closer as their pursuers coordinated their search using vehicles to cover the roads while teams on foot checked the forest paths. Jake counted at least 4 distinct engine sounds, suggesting a larger operation than he had initially realized. The drug network that had imprisoned the sisters was extensive enough to mobilize significant resources on short notice. "Tell me more about the operation you witnessed," Jake said quietly as they resumed climbing the old mining road. "How many people were involved? How often did they meet?" Amanda answered between labored breaths as she helped Hannah navigate around a fallen tree that blocked their path. "We saw maybe 8 or 10 people that first day, but over the months we overheard conversations about others. It sounded like they had people in different towns throughout the region, maybe even some in law enforcement. The possibility of corrupt officials within the local justice system was something Jake had been dreading but expecting. Drug operations of the scope the sisters described required protection from law enforcement, either through bribery or intimidation. It meant that even reaching his ranch and calling Sheriff Bradley might not guarantee safety. Claire added details as they walked, her voice growing stronger as adrenaline helped her push past the physical exhaustion. They talked about shipments coming up from Mexico through Utah and Colorado, then being broken down into smaller loads for distribution throughout Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Harold and Ruth's place was just one stop in a much bigger network. Hannah, despite being the youngest, had apparently been the most observant during their captivity. The red-haired woman who's chasing us now, she's called Victoria. She comes around every few months to check on things and collect money. She's definitely in charge of this whole area. Jake filed away the information, realizing that they weren't just dealing with local criminals, but with a regional operation that probably had connections to national and international drug trafficking. The stakes were higher than he had imagined, which explained why their pursuers were willing to commit multiple murders to protect their secret. They crested a ridge and looked down into a small valley where Jake could see the lights of his ranch house glowing warmly in the distance. The sight filled him with both hope and dread. Hope because it represented safety and communication with the outside world, but dread because their pursuers would certainly be expecting them to head for that obvious destination. "Is there another way to your ranch?" Amanda asked, apparently thinking along the same lines. "They're going to be watching the direct approaches." Jake studied the terrain below, trying to identify routes that would avoid the obvious ambush points while still allowing them to reach help. His grandfather had taught him these mountains as a child, but that was years ago and under very different circumstances than fleeing armed criminals in the dark. "There's a creek that runs along the north side of my property," he said finally. "If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to follow it to my barn without crossing open ground where they could spot us." The detour would add at least an hour to their journey, time they might not have if their pursuers were closing in systematically. But attempting a direct approach across open pasture would likely result in them being spotted and surrounded before they could reach safety. As they began the descent toward the valley floor, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. Dogs barking in the distance, the deep baying of hounds following a scent trail. Their pursuers had brought tracking dogs, eliminating any advantage that darkness and forest cover might have provided. "They have dogs," Jake told the sisters grimly. "That changes everything. We can't outrun dogs, and we can't hide from them for long." Amanda's face went pale in the moonlight, but her voice remained steady. "Then we need to reach help before they catch us. How far to your ranch?" "About 2 miles if we go straight, 3 if we take the creek route." Jake was calculating rapidly, trying to estimate how much time they had before the dogs tracked them down. "The dogs will follow our scent from the cabin, but it might take them a while to sort out our trail with all the back and forth we've been doing." They resumed their descent with new urgency, abandoning caution for speed as the sound of the tracking dogs grew gradually closer. Jake knew that once the dogs locked onto their scent trail, the pursuit would become relentless. Dogs could track faster than humans could flee, and they wouldn't tire or give up the way human searchers might. Hannah stumbled and nearly fell as they navigated a particularly steep section of the slope, saved only by Claire's quick reflexes in grabbing her arm. The youngest sister was reaching the limits of her endurance, her body pushed far beyond what 2 years of captivity and malnutrition had prepared her for. "I'm slowing everyone down," Hannah said through tears of frustration and exhaustion. "Maybe you should leave me and save yourselves." Amanda's response was immediate and fierce. "Don't you ever say that again. We're family, and family doesn't." Abandon each other. We've come too far to give up now. Jake was moved by the intensity of Amanda's loyalty to her sisters, but he was also worried about their collective ability to maintain the pace necessary to stay ahead of their pursuers. The dogs were getting closer, and he could now hear human voices coordinating the search behind them. There, Jake pointed ahead to where moonlight reflected off moving water. That's the creek. Once we reach it, we can follow it directly to my property without leaving much of a scent trail for the dogs. The creek was shallow but bitterly cold, the water immediately soaking through their inadequate footwear and numbing their feet within seconds. Jake led the way, testing each step carefully to avoid holes or slippery rocks that could result in injury. Behind him, the sisters formed a human chain, each holding onto the next to maintain stability in the treacherous footing. The cold water will help mask our scent, Jake explained as they waded upstream toward his ranch. Dogs can still track through water, but it's much harder and takes longer. The strategy bought them precious time, but Jake could see that the sisters were suffering badly from the added stress of cold water on their already weakened systems. Their lips were turning blue, and their movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated as hypothermia began to set in. "Keep moving," Amanda encouraged her sisters, though Jake could see that she was struggling just as much. "Think about warm beds and hot food. Think about calling Mom and Dad and telling them we're alive." The mention of their parents gave all. 3 sisters new motivation. The prospect of reuniting with family they hadn't seen in over 2 years, providing strength when their bodies wanted to quit. Jake found himself wondering what kind of people had raised such remarkable young women. Children who could maintain hope and humanity despite everything they had endured. They had been wading upstream for about 20 minutes when Jake heard the dogs reach the creek behind them. The baying changed tone as the animals lost the scent trail, becoming confused and frustrated as they cast about looking for where their quarry had entered the water. "That will slow them down," Jake said with grim satisfaction, "but they'll figure it out eventually. Tracking dogs are trained to work through problems like this." As if to emphasize his point, they heard Victoria's voice cutting through the night air with sharp commands to her search teams. "They're in the creek. Spread out along both banks and look for where they came out. Dogs, work the shoreline until you pick up the trail again." The professional efficiency of the search worried Jake more than random pursuit would have. These people knew what they were doing, suggesting military or law enforcement background that had been corrupted by criminal profit. They would be systematic, thorough, and ultimately successful unless Jake could get the sisters to safety very quickly. "How much farther?" Claire asked through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible over the sound of water flowing around their legs. Jake looked ahead to where he could see the dark outline of his barn silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Maybe half a mile. We're almost there." The barn represented more than just shelter. It contained Jake's truck, communication equipment, and weapons that would allow them to either escape the valley entirely or make a stand with better odds of success. Most importantly, it had a landline telephone that would work even if cellular service was being jammed or monitored. They were within 100 yards of Jake's property when they heard the dogs pick up their scent trail again. The triumphant baying of the hounds carried clearly across the water, followed immediately by Victoria's voice, rallying her teams for the final pursuit. "Move faster," Jake urged, though he could see that the sisters were already giving everything they had. "We're almost safe." They climbed out of the creek onto Jake's land, their soaked clothing immediately beginning to freeze in the sub-zero air. Jake's barn loomed ahead like a fortress, its familiar bulk promising warmth, weapons, and communication with the outside world. But as they approached the building, Jake noticed something that made his heart sink. The barn doors were standing, open, and there were lights inside that he definitely hadn't left on. Their pursuers had anticipated their destination and arrived first. turning Jake's hoped-for sanctuary into another trap. "It's a trap," Amanda whispered, apparently reaching the same conclusion as she studied the unusually bright interior of the barn. Jake nodded grimly, his mind racing through alternatives as the sound of pursuing dogs grew closer behind them. They were caught between converging enemies with nowhere left to run. The ranch house was too far away to reach before being overtaken, and the open pastures offered no cover for concealment. "The root cellar," Jake said suddenly, remembering a feature of his grandfather's ranch that he hadn't thought about in years. "There's an old root cellar behind the barn, built into the hillside. It's camouflaged and might not show up on their search." The root cellar had been dug during the Great Depression as a place to store vegetables and preserved foods through the harsh Montana winters. Jake's grandfather had maintained it carefully, but after his death it had been largely forgotten, overgrown with brush and hidden from casual observation. They circled around the barn, staying low and moving as quietly as possible, while Jake searched for the almost invisible entrance to the underground storage space. The pursuing dogs were close enough now that Jake could hear their handlers encouraging them, the hunt entering its final phase. "Here," Jake whispered, pushing aside a tangle of dead vines to reveal a wooden door set horizontally into the hillside. The entrance was barely visible even when you knew where to look, camouflaged by years of natural growth and deliberate concealment. Jake pulled the door open to reveal stone steps leading down into complete darkness. The air that rose from the depths was cold but dry, carrying the earthy smell of root vegetables and aged wood. Most importantly, it offered concealment from both visual and scent-based searches. The sisters descended into the cellar without hesitation, trusting Jake's judgment completely, despite having no idea what they might find in the underground space. Jake followed, pulling the door closed behind them and hoping that the camouflage would be sufficient to fool their pursuers. The root cellar was larger than Jake remembered, carved deep into the hillside with stone walls and a vaulted ceiling that created a space about the size of a small room. Wooden shelves lined the walls, still holding dusty jars of preserved foods that his grandfather had put up decades earlier. More importantly, Jake remembered that the cellar had been built with a second exit, a ventilation shaft that emerged among rocks about 50 yards away. If they were discovered, the escape route might allow them to slip away while their enemies were focused on the main entrance. "We should be safe here for a while," Jake whispered, though he kept his rifle ready just in case. "This place has been forgotten for years, and it's well hidden." They settled onto the stone floor, the sisters huddling together for warmth while Jake positioned himself near the entrance to listen for sounds of the search above them. The stone walls provided excellent sound insulation, muffling the dogs barking to a distant murmur that was almost soothing after hours of desperate flight. For the first time since leaving the garret basement, they had a moment to breathe and think, rather than simply react to immediate threats. Jake looked at the three sisters in the dim light, filtering through cracks around the door, amazed by their resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. "You saved our lives," Amanda said quietly, her voice filled with emotion that she had been suppressing during their escape. "We owe you everything." Jake shook his head firmly. "You don't owe me anything. What those people did to you was evil, and stopping evil is everyone's responsibility. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Hannah spoke up from where she was pressed against Claire's side for warmth. "Most people would have minded their own business or called the police and waited for someone else to handle it. You risked everything to help people you didn't even know." The simple observation reminded Jake of his grandfather's teachings about moral courage and the responsibility to act when action was needed. He had been raised to believe that character was defined not by what you said, but by what you did when faced with difficult choices. Above them, they could hear the search teams moving around the barn and outbuildings, their voices muffled but clearly frustrated by their failure to locate their quarry. Dogs whined and barked as they cast about for scent trails, but the stone construction of the root cellar seemed to be containing any odors that might give away their hiding place. "They'll expand their search eventually," Jake said quietly. "But it will take time, and they can't maintain this level of intensity indefinitely. When dawn comes, they'll have to worry about other people in the valley seeing their operation." Claire looked up with hope in her eyes for the first time since Jake had found them. "Does that mean we're going to be okay?" Jake considered his response carefully, not wanting to give false hope, but also recognizing that these young women needed something to believe in after years of having hope systematically destroyed. "I think our odds are getting better. We've made it this far, and every minute that passes is a minute closer to getting help." As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant sound of sirens approaching from the direction of town. Jake's heart leaped with the possibility that somehow law enforcement had become aware of the situation and was responding, but his hope was tempered by uncertainty about which side the authorities might support. The sirens grew closer, accompanied by the sound of multiple vehicles racing along the valley's main road. Above their heads, the search team's radio chatter became more urgent as Victoria's voice cut through the static with sharp commands. "Pack it up now," she ordered. "We've got company coming, and this is taking too long anyway. Fall back to the secondary positions and wait for further instructions." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as the immediate pursuit seemed to be breaking off. The arrival of law enforcement had apparently convinced their enemies to retreat, but Jake still wasn't certain whether the police would be allies or additional threats to the sisters' safety. "Stay here," Jake told the sisters as he prepared to carefully open the cellar door and assess the situation above. "Don't come out until I give the all clear, no matter what you hear." Amanda grabbed his arm as he moved toward the entrance. "What if something happens to you? What if you don't come back?" Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly, though he shared her concern about the uncertain situation they were walking into. "If I'm not back in 1 hour, use the escape tunnel to get out of here and head for town. Find someone you trust and tell them everything. Don't let anyone convince you to stay quiet about what happened." The instructions were simple but carried the weight of everything they had fought for during their escape. The sisters' testimony was the key to bringing down the drug network that had destroyed their lives, but only if they survived to tell their story to people who would listen and act on the information. Jake crept up the stone steps and cracked the cellar door open just enough to peer out at the activity around his barn. The immediate area appeared deserted, with no sign of the armed criminals who had been hunting them just minutes earlier. In the distance, he could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles approaching along the main road. The moment had come to discover whether their desperate flight through the Montana wilderness had led them to safety or into an even more dangerous situation where allies and enemies wore the same uniforms and spoke with voices of authority that might not be trusted. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to emerge from their underground sanctuary, carrying with him the hopes and fears of 3 remarkable young women who had already survived the unthinkable and deserved the chance to reclaim their lives from the criminals who had stolen their innocence and freedom. Jake emerged from the root cellar into a world transformed by flashing red and blue lights that painted the Montana landscape in alternating waves of color. The emergency vehicles had reached his ranch, and he counted at least 6 patrol cars, an ambulance, and what appeared to be federal agents' unmarked sedans scattered across his property. The sight filled him with cautious optimism, though years of living in rural communities had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood near Jake's front porch, his weathered face grim as he coordinated with agents wearing FBI windbreakers. Jake had known Bradley for 5 years, ever since moving to Clearwater Valley, and had always respected the man's integrity and dedication to protecting the community. But the scope of the drug operation the sisters had witnessed made Jake wonder if anyone in local law enforcement could be completely trusted. Taking a calculated risk, Jake stepped into the open, with his hands visible but his rifle still ready. "Sheriff Bradley!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "It's Jake Peterson. I need to talk to you." Bradley spun toward the sound, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm before recognizing Jake's voice. "Jake, what the hell is going on out here? We got reports of gunfire and people with dogs searching your property." The question suggested that Bradley genuinely didn't know about the sisters or the drug network, which gave Jake hope that at least some law enforcement officials were clean. But he remained cautious as he approached, watching for any signs that this might be an elaborate trap designed to recapture the women he had risked everything to save. "Sheriff, I need to know something before we go any further," Jake said, stopping about 20 feet away from the assembled officers. "Are you working with Harold and Ruth Garrett, or anyone else who might be involved in drug trafficking through this valley?" Bradley's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as the implications of Jake's question became clear. "Drug trafficking? Jake, what are you talking about?" The Garretts called in a report about trespassers and possible theft, but nobody said anything about drugs. The revelation that Harold and Ruth had contacted law enforcement with their own version of events confirmed Jake's suspicions about their criminal sophistication. They were trying to control the narrative, painting Jake as the criminal, while positioning themselves as victims of his supposed crimes. One of the FBI agents, a tall woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, stepped forward with obvious interest in Jake's accusations. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. We're here investigating reports of suspicious activity in this area. What can you tell us about drug trafficking?" Jake studied Agent Martinez carefully, looking for any signs that she might be compromised by the same corruption that had allowed the drug network to operate for years. Her direct approach and willingness to ask hard questions suggested genuine law enforcement interest rather than an attempt to suppress information. "I have 3 women hidden nearby who were kidnapped over 2 years ago after witnessing a major drug operation," Jake said, his words causing an immediate stir among the assembled officers. "They've been held captive by Harold and Ruth Garrett, who are part of a trafficking network that moves drugs from Mexico through this region." Agent Martinez exchanged glances with her partner before focusing intently on Jake. "These women, are they safe? Do they need immediate medical attention?" "No. They're safe for now, but they've been through hell," Jake replied. 2 years of imprisonment, malnutrition, and abuse. They need medical care, protection, and the chance to tell their story to people who will believe them and act on what they reveal." Sheriff Bradley shook his head in apparent disbelief. "Jake, the Garretts are retired folks who keep to themselves. Are you sure about these accusations? This is pretty serious stuff you're talking about." Jake understood Bradley's skepticism, knowing how carefully the Garretts had cultivated their image as harmless retirees seeking peaceful isolation. But he also recognized that time was critical. The criminal network was still active, and Victoria's people might regroup for another attempt to eliminate the witnesses to their operation. "Sheriff, Harold Garrett is chained up in his own basement right now, where he kept 3 sisters prisoner for over 2 years, Jake said with conviction. "Ruth Garrett fled when I rescued the women, and she's probably contacting other members of their network as we speak. If you want proof, it's all there at their farmhouse." Agent Martinez was already reaching for her radio, apparently deciding that Jake's claims were serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. "This is Martinez. I need a tactical team at the Garrett property immediately. Possible hostage situation and major drug operation. Treat as extremely dangerous." The federal response was swift and professional, with additional vehicles racing toward the Garrett farmhouse while crime scene technicians began preparing to process what might be extensive evidence of long-term criminal activity. Jake felt a surge of relief as he realized that legitimate law enforcement was finally taking action against the network that had destroyed so many lives. "Where are the women now?" Agent Martinez asked, her tone conveying both urgency and compassion for victims who had already suffered far too much. Jake gestured toward the hidden root cellar, knowing that the moment had come to bring the sisters into the open and begin the process of reclaiming their lives. "They're in a safe place nearby, but they're going to need careful handling. They've been traumatized and might not trust authority figures initially. We have victim specialists trained for exactly this kind of situation," Martinez assured him. "Our priority is their safety and well-being, not just their testimony about what they witnessed." As Jake led the agents toward the root cellar, he could hear radio chatter describing the scene at the Garrett property. Harold had been found exactly as Jake had left him, chained in the basement that had served as a prison for 3 innocent young women. Ruth was missing, but evidence of the sisters' prolonged captivity was obvious and overwhelming. Jake approached the concealed entrance to the root cellar with Agent Martinez and a female paramedic who had been briefed on the situation. "Amanda, Claire, Hannah," he called softly. "It's Jake. I'm here with people who are going to help you, FBI agents and medical personnel. You're safe now." The cellar door opened slowly, revealing Amanda's cautious face as she peered out at the assembled officials. Her eyes were wide, with fear and hope, the conflicting emotions of someone who had been disappointed too many times to easily trust in rescue. "Are they really here to help us?" Amanda asked, her voice barely audible as she studied the agents and paramedics gathered around the entrance. Agent Martinez stepped forward carefully, her posture non-threatening as she addressed the frightened young woman. "Yes, we're here to help. I'm Special Agent Martinez with the FBI. We're going to make sure you and your sisters are safe, and we're going to stop the people who hurt you." One by one, the sisters emerged from their underground hiding place into the flashing lights and organized chaos of a major federal investigation. Claire and Hannah clung to Amanda as they were gently guided toward the waiting ambulance, their eyes darting nervously between the various officials who surrounded them. The paramedic began immediate assessment of their condition, noting signs of malnutrition, exposure, and the psychological trauma that would require long-term treatment. But she also observed the remarkable strength and resilience that had allowed them to survive an ordeal that might have broken others completely. "We're going to take you to the hospital for evaluation and treatment," the paramedic explained gently. "You'll have advocates there to help you through the process, and no one will force you to do anything you're not ready for." As the sisters were helped into the ambulance, Amanda turned back to Jake with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply, the 2 words carrying the weight of everything they had been through together. "You gave us our lives back." Jake felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him as he watched the ambulance drive away, carrying 3 remarkable young women toward the first real safety they had known in over 2 years. Their journey to full recovery would be long and difficult, but at least it was beginning. Agent Martinez approached Jake as crime scene investigators, began processing his property for evidence of the night's events. "We're going to need a full statement from you about everything that happened, but first, I want you to know that preliminary reports from the Garrett property confirm your account completely." The validation was satisfying, but Jake found himself more interested in what would happen to the criminal network that had operated with such impunity for so long. "What about Victoria and the others who were chasing us? They disappeared when your people arrived, but they're still out there." "We've been tracking this organization for months," Martinez revealed, surprising Jake with the scope of the federal investigation. Your rescue of those women and their testimony will give us the evidence we need to bring down the entire network from Mexico to Canada. Jake learned that the FBI had been aware of unusual drug trafficking patterns in the region, but had lacked the specific evidence and witness testimony needed to identify key players and locations. The sisters' first-hand knowledge of the operation would provide the missing pieces that investigators needed to build comprehensive cases against dozens of criminals. Over the following hours, Jake provided detailed statements about everything he had witnessed and experienced during the rescue. Federal agents documented the route of their escape, the weapons and tactics used by their pursuers, and every detail that might help identify and locate members of the criminal network. As dawn broke over Clearwater Valley, Jake stood on his porch watching investigators process evidence that would eventually send multiple people to federal prison for decades. The Garrett farmhouse had been revealed as a sophisticated operation base with hidden rooms, encrypted communications equipment, and records documenting years of drug trafficking activity. Sheriff Bradley approached Jake as the initial investigative. His face wound down, his expression mixing embarrassment with genuine admiration for what Jake had accomplished. "I owe you an apology," Bradley said honestly. "I should have picked up on the signs that something was wrong with the Garretts. A good sheriff protects his community, and I failed those girls." Jake shook his head, understanding the difficulty of detecting criminal activity that was specifically designed to avoid law enforcement attention. "You can't blame yourself for the actions of people who were experts at deception. What matters is that we're stopping them now." The broader implications of the investigation became clear over the following days as federal agents arrested suspects throughout the region. Victoria and several of her key lieutenants were captured attempting to flee to Mexico, while raids on storage facilities and safe houses uncovered millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs and criminal proceeds. Jake received regular updates on the sisters' condition and recovery progress from victim advocates who kept him informed while respecting the family's privacy. Amanda, Claire, and Hannah were slowly adjusting to freedom while receiving medical treatment and psychological counseling to help them process their traumatic experiences. Most importantly, the sisters had been reunited with their parents, who had spent over 2 years believing their daughters were dead. The reunion was emotional beyond description, a family restored after enduring the worst nightmare any parent could imagine. Video of their embraces at the hospital brought tears to the eyes of hardened investigators who had seen too much human suffering in their careers. 3 weeks after the rescue, Jake received a letter that moved him more than any recognition or reward could have. Written in Amanda's careful handwriting, it described the sisters' progress in recovery and their determination to use their experience to help other victims of trafficking and abuse. "We want you to know that what you did that night changed more than just our lives," Amanda had written. "You showed us that there are still people in the world who will risk everything to help others, even strangers. That knowledge is helping us heal and believe in goodness again." The letter went on to describe the sisters' plans for the future. Amanda was preparing to enter college to study social work, hoping to become an advocate for trafficking victims. Claire was working with artists and writers to document their experience through creative expression that might help others understand and heal from similar trauma. Hannah, despite being the youngest, had decided to become a public speaker, sharing their story to raise awareness about human trafficking and the importance of community vigilance. Jake kept the letter in his desk drawer, reading it whenever. He needed reminding about why he had chosen to act rather than simply report what he suspected to authorities. The decision to personally intervene had been dangerous and could have ended tragically, but it had also led to the rescue of 3 innocent lives and the dismantling of a criminal enterprise that had caused immeasurable harm. The trial of Harold and Ruth Garrett became a media sensation, drawing national attention to the issue of human trafficking in rural America. The sisters' testimony was powerful and compelling, delivered with a strength and dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. Harold received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, while Ruth was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison. Victoria and her network associates received similarly harsh sentences as federal prosecutors used the sisters' testimony to build cases that dismantled the entire regional drug trafficking operation. The investigation expanded internationally, leading to arrests and prosecutions in Mexico, Canada, and throughout the United States. For Jake, life gradually returned to something approaching normal, though he found himself changed by the experience, in ways both subtle and profound. He continued ranching, but also became involved in community education about human trafficking and the warning signs that might indicate criminal activity in rural areas. The Garrett property was eventually sold at auction, with proceeds going to victim compensation funds and organizations that fought human trafficking. The basement where the sisters had been imprisoned was filled with concrete, erasing the physical reminder of their suffering while preserving the foundation for a more hopeful future. 6 months after the rescue, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Amanda arrived at his ranch on a warm spring day, looking healthy and confident in a way that would have been impossible during their desperate flight through the winter forest. She had driven from the university where she was excelling in her studies, making the journey to thank Jake in person for giving her the chance to pursue dreams that had seemed impossible during her captivity. "I wanted you to see that what you did mattered," Amanda said, as they sat on his porch drinking coffee and watching cattle graze in the distance. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're living." The distinction was important, representing the difference between mere existence and the full engagement with life that the sisters had been denied for so long. They were building relationships, pursuing education, and contributing to their communities in ways that honored their experience while looking toward a future defined by hope rather than trauma. Amanda also brought news about her sisters. Claire had been accepted to art school and was creating powerful works that explored themes of captivity and freedom. Hannah, despite her youth, had become an effective advocate for trafficking victims, her speeches moving audiences throughout the country to action and awareness. "We think about that night often," Amanda continued. "Not just the fear and danger, but the moment when you appeared in that basement. It was like hope materializing out of darkness, proof that someone cared enough to risk everything for people they didn't even know." Jake deflected the praise, as he always did when people tried to make him into a hero for doing what he considered basic human decency. But Amanda persisted, explaining how their rescue had inspired them to dedicate their lives to helping others in similar situations. "You didn't just save 3 lives that night," she concluded. "You saved all the lives we'll be able to help. Because we're free to do that work, the ripple effects of what you did will continue for generations." As Amanda prepared to leave, she handed Jake a small wooden carving that Claire had made for him. It depicted a man and 3 women walking together through a forest, their faces turned towards sunlight breaking through the trees ahead. The symbolism was clear and deeply moving, representing the journey from darkness to light that they had taken together. The carving sits on Jake's mantle now, a reminder of the most important night of his life and the 3 remarkable young women who taught him about courage, resilience, and the power of refusing to abandon hope even in the darkest circumstances. Their story continues to inspire others who face seemingly impossible situations, proving that freedom is always worth fighting for and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose to act with moral courage. The Clearwater Valley is peaceful now, its reputation as a drug trafficking corridor replaced by recognition as a community that stands together against those who would exploit the vulnerable. Jake still works his ranch, still rises before dawn to check on his cattle, but he also knows that he helped write a different ending to a story that could have ended in tragedy. 3 sisters who were supposed to disappear forever instead became voices for the voiceless, their survival and recovery a testament to the human capacity for healing and growth. Their freedom, purchased at such a high price, continues to create freedom for others who find themselves trapped in similar darkness. And in a world that often seems dominated by selfishness and indifference, their story stands as proof that there are still people willing to risk everything for strangers, still heroes who emerge from ordinary lives when circumstances demand extraordinary courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.